Hey everybody, nice to meet you all again, and thank you very much for attending this live streaming event. This is week 4 or class 4 of the CBT Skills for Anxiety series that I've been recording and placing onto YouTube. If you haven't seen any of the other videos, I recommend you have a look at week 1, week 2, and week 3, for example, and watch those videos and practice some of the exercises in those videos. And all of these videos, preceding videos, build on the skills week by week. So today we're building on the skills that we have talked about in weeks 1, 2, and 3. So the learning is cumulative. Okay, so have a look at the other 3 videos and they will set the context and introduce you to many of the main themes that we're discussing in today's session. Now, by way of a brief recap, let me get my notes on my screen so we can briefly recap what we've discussed in previous weeks. But before the recap, I'll deal with a few questions that have been sent to me by people who view and listen to these live stream events. Okay, please keep your questions coming in. I love to hear from people via email or through the YouTube channel. Okay, first question is, what is CBT? CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, is a form of therapy that was developed by Dr. Aaron Beck. He was a psychiatrist, and he developed these the CBT model, but based on previous kind of generations of philosophy, going way back to the Stoics. But anyway, Dr. Aaron Beck, psychiatrist, 1960s, he developed CBT, and he had been working as a psychoanalyst with clients mainly suffering from depression and anxiety. And what he found was that during the sessions and during the weeks and weeks of meeting with his clients, many of them weren't really improving very much. They were still reporting feeling low mood and feeling depressed, for example. And he decided to take a closer look at this. Well, why aren't these people improving? And what he found was that many of the clients that weren't improving were still using quite negative terminology to describe themselves, the world, the future, other people. They had quite a negative thinking style. Okay, so what he decided to do was to begin challenging people in a nice, supportive, compassionate kind of way, challenging their negative, unhelpful thinking and helping them to perhaps explore alternatives to those negative thoughts, alternatives that were perhaps more compassionate, more helpful, more constructive, more supportive of themselves. And then what he found was that people started to feel better. Their depression started to lift alongside the changes in the way they spoke about themselves, the future, and the world around them. And very interestingly, the way that they began to think about themselves, the world, and the future. So he drew this very close link between the way that we think and how we feel. So cognitive behavior therapy, it's a form of psychological intervention. It's a form of talking therapy whereby the therapist helps us to begin to understand the link between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And they help us to explore our thoughts in different situations. They help us to keep track of our thoughts, and then we explore them in the session. And if the thoughts are not helpful, constructive, compassionate, and kind towards ourselves, the therapist will help us to begin exploring alternative ways of thinking. Okay, so it's a gradual process of really changing the way that we think from unhelpful to helpful. Okay. Okay. Question number 2, should I attend group CBT or should I have individual CBT? It's really a choice for the individual. CBT is very popular these days, and in most areas you can find individual CBT therapists, and some of those therapists will provide group CBT. Okay, there are pros and cons really to attending individual versus group CBT. In terms of individual CBT, you have one-on-one attention from the therapist, and that therapist will focus on you and your issues exclusively. To nobody else is involved in that process, so you have 100% attention from the therapist, and they work on your issues with you. Okay. In terms of group therapy, oftentimes therapists will set up a group CBT for anxiety or CBT for depression, a 10-week group, and the group will meet once per week for an hour and a half at a certain location. And oftentimes there'll be 10 or 15 people perhaps in one of those groups. And the therapist will take everybody through a set of very important CBT skills for helping to manage their depression or the anxiety, for example. Okay. And during those groups, there usually is or are opportunities for individual people attending to talk about various issues that may perhaps help them feel anxious or depressed. And they might want to volunteer some of that information and talk about some of the thoughts that go through their mind when they feel depressed, for example. And the therapist will use that as a kind of a teaching tool to show everybody how to begin to look for more helpful, constructive, alternative ways of thinking. There can be a sense of camaraderie in group CBT. So everybody's in the same boat, as it were, and people, if the sessions are managed effectively by the therapist, people are very supportive and welcoming to all other group members. Okay. And there's a certain kind of, it's quite nice to know that other people are in the same boat as you and that they're all together working on similar issues to yourself. So if you do attend group CBT therapy, I would make sure that you do a bit of background research and check out that the person is a qualified CBT therapist. And I would recommend also to attend a group that focuses exclusively on one issue or one problem, such as depression or anxiety or OCD or whatever it is, rather than a CBT group that is open to everybody and works on all kinds of lots of different issues. Okay. So it's better for it to be streamlined and to focus on the issues that you feel that you're experiencing. Okay. Okay. Does CBT say that all of my problems are caused by my thinking? No, it doesn't. And that's a popular misconception in the press, that cognitive behavioral therapy says that it's just our thoughts that make us feel the way that we do. But that's not actually the full story. What we say is that there's a close relationship between the way that we think and the way that we feel, okay? And also the way that we behave and how we feel, okay? So there's kind of an interrelationship between these three things: thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Now, it's fair to say that, for example, where anxiety is concerned, there are many different potential causes of anxiety. And these can be issues in childhood. These can be come about from bullying at school, relationship issues, financial problems, all sorts of things. Okay. And genetics as well. So we can kind of inherit a predisposition, perhaps, to suffering from anxiety if our parents have experienced anxiety. And also, we can learn to be anxious from being around other significant others, such as parents, close family members, for example. So if they're quite anxious, we, as children, we can pick up on that and we can begin to almost mimic that behavior and to take on board that anxiety. Okay, so many and different reasons for anxiety, many different reasons for depression as well. Okay, But CBT doesn't say that it's only your thoughts that create the depression and that's the root cause of it. So many different causes, but what we say is that if we can begin to look at the way we're thinking and behaving, okay, and perhaps begin to replace unhelpful thoughts and behaviors with more helpful, constructive, compassionate thoughts and behavior, that will help to ease the anxiety and ease the depression, okay, and hopefully eliminate the anxiety or the depression. So no matter what the cause is, CBT can help with it. And, beginning to look at our thoughts and our behaviors is certainly a helpful starting point. Okay. What's the difference? Next question is, what's the difference between CBT and counseling? There are many different schools of counseling. So there's client-centered therapy, psychoanalysis, and there are many forms of psychoanalysis as well. There's existential psychotherapy, cognitive behavior therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy, EMDR. There are many different forms of talking therapies or counseling, as it were. The main difference, I guess, is that CBT is quite structured and formal. And when we attend CBT sessions, the therapist, as I've said earlier, will help us to understand problematic thinking and behaviors and help us to look for more helpful, supportive, compassionate, and constructive thoughts and behaviors. And the therapist will help to put together a plan to help you to make changes in the way that you think and you behave in order to improve the way that you feel. Whereas many forms of counseling are not as active and directive as CBT. And they're, I mustn't tar them all with the same brush, but many forms of counseling are more about having a sympathetic listening ear, okay, and having that space to express the way that you feel without any judgment, without any intervention, without any seeking to change the way that you think or feel, okay. Client-centered therapy, for example, okay, provides that space where you can talk about how you feel, and there's no judgment at all from the therapist, and there's no intention from the therapist to begin to find a solution for you or help you find a solution. Okay, the idea is that the safe space that is provided for you in counseling is therapeutic in and of itself. Okay, it's important to point out as well that CBT is non-judgmental. So we don't judge clients, we don't judge their thoughts and behaviors and say that this is right and this is wrong, not at all. But we help people to explore what thoughts and behaviors might be helpful, might not be helpful, maybe they're contributing to the problem. Okay. Final question for now, is CBT the best treatment for everybody? No, it's not necessarily. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that CBT is a very effective form of intervention for a whole range of issues, such as anxiety, depression, and worry, for example. But it's not for everybody. Like any other form of psychological intervention or counseling, it might suit some people and not others. So if you're happy to be very proactive and involved and doing homework tasks, for example, CBT perhaps is more, might be more attractive to you. But if you just want that space to express how you feel without having to do anything in between sessions and just make the most of that very valuable time to express all of your thoughts and feelings, perhaps another form of therapy is better for you, such as client-centered therapy. Okay. Some people have issues in childhood that they feel that they would like to get to the bottom of. And the idea is that if we explore our childhood issues, they have a direct bearing on the here and now. Okay. Now, in CBT, we do go back in time to help the person explore, for example, things that have happened in the past, perhaps in childhood. Okay. but we only stay there in the past for a temporary period of time. And we help the client to understand what happened back then and how that is perhaps influencing the here and now. And then once we gain that understanding, we then bring the focus back to the here and now, and we work on the future. Some forms of therapy, such as psychoanalysis, often will focus a large amount of time on the past, and especially childhood issues. And again, there's no right or wrong with this. From a CBT perspective, we often don't see it as helpful or productive to stay in the past for too long, okay? Because the client is living in the here and now, and we want to help them improve the way they feel in the here and now, and to learn a whole range of skills that they can implement in the here and now. But from a psychoanalytic point of view, it's very important work for the client to do, exploring past issues and getting to the bottom of childhood experiences. Okay, that's the questions. Let me open my sheet, my notes for today. Okay, a very brief recap on previous weeks, the stuff that we've covered. So we've looked at this idea that thoughts are not always helpful, okay? And there are a number of thinking errors that we often make, and these thinking errors can play a large part in anxious feelings. An important skill is being able to keep track of our thoughts when we feel anxious. And in previous sessions, we've looked at, and I have talked about the ABC sheet, where we keep a record of what's happened in a specific situation, the thoughts that went through our mind during or immediately after that situation, and the consequences or the emotional consequences of those thoughts, okay? And we look at that relationship then between the thoughts and the feelings. And then the next important skill is being able to spot which thinking errors we're making. And finally, we need to be able to explore more helpful, constructive, compassionate ways of thinking in those situations and transferring those skills into other situations as well. That's kind of the flavor of what we've covered so far. Okay. Link between behavior and anxiety. Remember, anxiety is often present when we feel some kind of a threat, okay, real or imagined. And when we feel anxious or worried, it's quite natural that our behavior would be affected in some kind of way. Now, one thing that I think it's fair to say we all do from time to time is we avoid situations where we feel anxious, okay? Absolutely normal. It's a human, it's part of human behavior, you know, and it makes sense in many different situations where we perceive some kind of a danger. We'd want to avoid that situation. It makes absolute perfect sense. And we've talked about that in previous sessions. Okay. Some of the behaviors that we tend to rely on when we feel anxious, okay, is we might avoid that situation, okay? We might minimize the frequency of our being in that situation, or we might minimize the length of time that we're in that situation. We might use safety behaviors. What are safety behaviors? Well, we touched on them briefly in a previous session, but basically, in terms of anxiety, a safety behavior might be if we're nervous about going out in public or going on the bus, for example. A safety behavior might be that we enlist the help of other people to go with us every single time because we feel anxious. Now, if we have physical disabilities or other kinds of issues that we generally need help and support with, and we need another person to accompany us, absolutely fine, no problem at all, okay? But if it's to do with anxiety, just anxiety, I don't mean just anxiety to minimalize it, but if it's anxiety by itself, we want to get to a position where we improve our confidence and we begin to minimize the anxiety and become more independent. without having to rely on the support of others quite so much. Okay, we're going to look at a strategy to do this in just a short while. Okay, sometimes we might comfort eat when we're feeling anxious. Okay, we might go and buy some chocolate or some other high sugary food, for example, or something high in carbohydrates. Okay, obviously there are health issues that can be related to frequent eating of foods that are high in sugar and carbohydrates, for example. Okay, other people might use drugs or alcohol when they feel anxious. Obviously, again, there are health consequences, physical health consequences of using drugs and also of relying on alcohol to help minimize our anxiety. Okay, and remember, in terms of drugs and alcohol, if we use those to help reduce our anxiety, it's only temporary. It doesn't fix the anxiety. The anxiety doesn't go away. Okay, and if anything, we become to be dependent on the alcohol or the drug. We can become more dependent on it as time goes by. So much better to get to the root cause of the anxiety, okay, without resorting to drugs or alcohol to help us to minimize it temporarily. Okay. You remember in previous sessions we looked at various questions that we ask ourselves when we've kept a record of the way that we're thinking in different situations and how we think in situations where we feel anxious specifically. And we asked ourselves a number of questions. Okay, well, these questions, we can also use them to explore the behavioral strategies that we're using when we feel anxious, like the avoidance, like using alcohol, etc., comfort eating. Okay, we can ask ourselves, how is this behavior helping me to relieve or reduce anxiety? Okay, remember the key here, some behaviors will seem to reduce anxiety in the very short term, and it's only temporary. And then the anxiety can come back up again, like comfort eating, like alcohol use, for example. We ask ourselves, is this behavior helping things in the longer term? Okay. Think about several weeks, several months over the longer term, over the years. How is this behavior actually helping me to eliminate the anxiety? Okay. How is this behavior helping me to develop new coping skills? Okay. Is this behavior helpful, constructive, compassionate, and realistic? Very important. Am I being fair to myself with using this behavioral strategy? Okay. Remember, some of the behaviors that we use when we're anxious, some of them will be helpful and constructive, and some of them may not be. Okay. So we're exploring which behaviors are actually helpful and constructive here. Okay. And very important to remember that some behaviors can also prevent us from learning about the difficult situations and can prevent us from finding ways of coping and managing independently. Okay. Let's look briefly at avoidance. So I said earlier that it's absolutely normal, it's understandable that we would want to avoid situations where we feel anxious. Okay. And we have a propensity to maintain our keep ourselves alive and maintain our health and safety. Okay. But sometimes we can use that to extremes and begin to avoid all sorts of situations that actually don't present any real dangers to us, but we have felt anxious in those situations in the past, so we begin to avoid them. Let's look at a fictitious example. So John had recently begun to feel anxious about going on the bus. He worried that people were looking at him. he decided to stop using the bus and travel by other means. Now, immediately, John felt some form of relief from the anxiety. Again, that's understandable. He doesn't now have to sit on the bus and worry about whether people might be looking at him or not. Okay, so he will have some form of relief from the anxiety. Okay, but it's only temporary, oftentimes. The relief is likely to be temporary. By avoiding the bus journeys, John has confirmed to himself that being on a bus is a scary place to be, and I'm better off avoiding it. Being on a bus is something that I can't cope with. Okay. Being on a bus makes me anxious, and therefore I avoid it, and therefore I'm not anxious. Okay. He has reinforced the idea within his own mind that buses are threatening and must be avoided. Okay. He has taken away the learning opportunity. It's an opportunity to learn new skills at managing anxiety without the need to avoid going on a bus. Okay. Now, sometimes buses late at night going through rough parts of town might not be the safest place to be. So, we have to use our own kind of skills and understanding about, local situations where we live. But on the whole, in many areas, traveling on the bus, certainly in the daytime, early evening, is a very safe place to be. Okay. So remember, John's taken away that learning opportunity. He's taken away the opportunity to learn a different way of coping with those anxious feelings when he's on the bus. He's removed himself from the situation. Okay. Avoiding the bus will probably impact negatively on John's social life, especially if he used to travel to work on the bus. Maybe he went to meet friends on the bus. He went to the gym on the bus. He went to socialize on the bus. Okay. So now he's taken away some of that. He's restricted his social life to some extent. And in future situations where John begins to feel anxious, he may then begin to avoid that situation also. So he starts off with the bus, avoiding the bus because he feels anxious. In future, he may, for example, feel some anxiety in the supermarket, and then he might restrict himself going to the supermarket and avoid that altogether and just order his groceries to be delivered online. Again, similar situation. He's kind of closing the door on learning opportunities, but at the same time, he's restricting his social life. Okay. And the world gradually becomes a smaller and smaller place when we keep avoiding situations. Okay. Key points about anxiety. It usually rises and falls in a relatively short space of time. Okay. So if we drawed it on a chart, we would graph the anxiety goes up like this, stays up there for a while. We think it's going to last forever, but as sure as night follows day, the anxiety comes back down again. Okay. That's key point number one. Key point number two, anxiety most of the time is absolutely harmless. It's a normal human feeling. Okay. We all experience it. Myself also. We all experience some forms of anxiety in various situations at various times. Okay. So it's a normal human emotion. Exposure to the feared situation, and this is what we're going to look at now, helps to reduce anxiety, and it increases our sense of being able to cope with situations. Okay. That's what we're going to look at right now. A quick proviso: when I say anxiety is most often absolutely harmless, okay? If somebody has, for example, physical health issues such as heart disease or very high blood pressure that is untreated, for example, it's not good for them to be anxious. Excuse me, it's not good for any of us to be anxious. But there are, small, in a small proportion of cases, anxiety can be, a bit more threatening to our personal well-being. And what I'd recommend is, if you have any concerns about physical health issues, um, uh, go and see your primary care physician or your general practitioner and get checked out. Okay, and talk to them about the anxiety as well. Okay, but aside from that, in most situations, anxiety is absolutely harmless and it's temporary. What goes up must come down. Remind yourself of that. What goes up must come down. Okay. So let's have a look at exposure. So there's a whole number of issues, experiences in life, situations where we might feel anxious. So it could be to do with travel, going on the bus, giving presentations, attending meetings at work, joining a fitness class, family get-togethers, or speaking up for yourself, going to see the doctor. There's a whole range of situations where we might feel some anxiety. Okay. It wouldn't be a good thing for us to begin to avoid those situations, okay, for the reasons I've stated earlier. Now, if there's a situation where independently, objectively, you can see that actually there is no danger in this situation, like going on the bus, going on the train, giving a presentation at work, for example. If there's a situation that makes you feel very anxious, okay, keeps you awake at night time thinking about it, what I would recommend is get yourself a sheet of A4 blank paper, okay, or a standard size sheet of paper. And on that piece of paper, draw a ladder. So just a nice wide ladder with perhaps 10 steps on that ladder. Okay. Now, in terms of the specific issue that you have chosen, let's talk about going on the bus. So John avoids going on the bus. Okay. And let's imagine that John doesn't go on the bus for a period of 6 months. And he begins to see that that's problematic for his social life. John gets together a piece of paper, a ladder with 10 steps on the ladder. Okay. At the bottom of the ladder, he would write something that doesn't really create any anxiety for him related to going on a bus. So, for example, at the bottom of the ladder might be going to sit at the bus shelter, but the bus stop, okay, and not get on the bus. That might create very little anxiety for him, okay. At the top of the ladder, so he would write down at step 1, sitting in the bus shelter for 15 minutes, okay, step 1 of the ladder. At step 10 of the ladder, he might put the most feared situation related to bus travel, and that might be traveling for 20 minutes on the bus at a busy time of day. Okay, that might feel unachievable to him. So, but for now, he writes that at step 10 of the ladder, right at the top. Okay. Now, in between, starting from step 1, he needs to enter something else at step 2, step 3, step 4, all related to traveling on a bus. Okay. And each step will get progressively more difficult. So step 2 could be spending a half an hour at the bus stop. Okay. Step 3 could be getting on the bus and just traveling for 4 minutes or so, or 3 minutes, or 2 bus stops. Okay, whatever John decides is manageable, but each step needs to be a little bit challenging, and a bit more challenging than the preceding step. Okay. So John builds this up now step by step. He writes in his ladder step 3, step 4, step 5. He works all the way up gradually. So these are gradual steps, okay? Just like when we're learning to sing, dance, walk, talk, we do it in gradual steps. We don't jump straight to the finishing point, okay? The same with this strategy as well. So what John does then is he sets aside a time when he's going to get working on this hierarchy ladder, and he's going to start implementing each step. Sitting at the bus stop, step 1, step 2, sitting there for half an hour, step 3, getting on the bus for one bus stop. The next step is 2 bus stops. Next step is 3 bus stops, for example. So it's a graded, it's a hierarchy, okay? And we're exposing ourselves to the situation that makes us feel anxious. And when we do that, what we're doing is we're doing a number of things. One is we're improving our confidence at being able to cope step by step with these things, this thing that has been making us feel anxious, that we've been avoiding. Okay. Step 2, we get to learn that although at each step on this ladder, when we implement each step, we're feeling anxious. Each time we notice the anxiety goes up, it stays there for a while, and then it always comes back down. And so that's another very important learning curve as well, a learning opportunity. We're also learning that actually we can put together this kind of strategy, okay, this hierarchy, and we can implement this independently. And we can overcome the anxiety that we feel in that situation, okay? Now, in the early days of the hierarchy, if John feels that he needs some help or support, maybe he'll have a friend go with him on the bus, okay? That needs to be temporary. And what he's working towards, ideally, as he moves up each step in the hierarchy, is to become less and less dependent on the friend to be with him on the bus, and to become more and more independent and to travel on the bus by himself. Okay. If you have any questions about that, feel free to get in touch. If you have any questions about anything at all to do with anxiety or CBT generally, please do get in touch. That strategy of using the hierarchy can be used in many different situations. We just have to break down each situation into 10 steps. Sometimes we could break it down into 5 steps, okay? If it's, generally speaking, if the thing that we're trying to do is creates a great deal of anxiety and feels very difficult for us, we would want to break it down into smaller steps. So more steps, perhaps 10, okay? If it's something that doesn't seem too frightening or too challenging, we could perhaps break it down into 5 steps. Okay. And the idea is that each step on this hierarchy, we repeat it until we feel very little anxiety in doing that particular step. And then we move on to the next step and we begin to feel challenged a little bit more each time. Okay. So we can use this with almost any situation that makes us feel anxious, like giving presentations, for example. We can break that down into 5 steps or 10 steps. Okay. What we're doing here is we're making it into bite-sized chunks that are manageable, challenging, but manageable nonetheless. Okay. Okay. Let me see if there are any more questions. And it's always a pleasure to give these presentations, and I'm very happy to do so. And I always look forward to keeping in touch with people. There are many ways to get in touch with me. Please do subscribe to the channel if you found this video useful. Other videos, leave comments and feedback, get in touch with me, share the link. I try to be doing this each Sunday at around about 7 p.m. British time, but not always. Okay, sometimes it varies, and sometimes I have other appointments that I have to take care of. But in any event, be kind, compassionate to yourself, okay, and have a great week ahead. And I hope to hear from you soon. Bye-bye.